Live from KJRH in Tulsa, Sam Jones, Beth Ringel, Nightcast reporter Marty Griffin, meteorologist Gary Shore, and sports director Jerry Weber. This is News Center 2 Nightcast.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And then in the next split second, the unthinkable happened. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded into a huge fireball. It occurred shortly after 10:30 local time this morning. On board the spacecraft, 7 crew members, including the first participant in NASA's Citizen in Space program. Krista McAuliffe was a 37-year-old school teacher from New Hampshire. She and the others died in that blast. Their deaths were the first in nearly a quarter of a century of manned space flights in America.
But Sam, there's still a question that remains unanswered, and that is why. An explanation may be a while in coming. NASA Administrator Jesse Moore says a conclusion can't be reached until there's been a careful review of all the data. Meanwhile, a search for what's left of the shuttle has been called off until tomorrow morning. Pieces of the Challenger reportedly rained down on the Atlantic Ocean for more than an hour after the explosion. The biggest chunk of debris found so far is reportedly just 2 feet wide and 2 feet to 10 feet long. For an update on the tragedy, here's NBC's Peter Hackus.
Still no answers to what caused the worst tragedy in U.S. spaceflight history. 75 seconds into what had been a routine launch, a tremendous explosion as Challenger flew at 2,000 miles an hour, 10 miles up, 18 miles off the Florida coast. A slow-motion replay indicates a possible problem with one of 2 peel-off rocket boosters. Then a blast that shattered the shuttle's huge external fuel tank and the shuttle spacecraft with it. Aboard, astronauts Dr. Judith Resnick, Francis Scobie, mission commander, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, teacher Krista McAuliffe, Gregory Jarvis, and pilot Michael Smith. Teacher McAuliffe's family, standing on Cape Canaveral bleachers, watched in horror as they slowly began to realize what had happened. At the White House, another spectator looked on as tragedy struck. Spokesman Larry Speaks described the presidential reaction.
The president stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched.
With few details of what caused the loss of 7 lives, manned spaceflight director Jesse Moore was asked, could it be NASA was under too much pressure to get this flight off?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that.
For school children who had watched the tragic flight, President Reagan tried to explain the as yet unexplainable.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons.
A flag lowered to half-mast at the U.S. Capitol reflects the sorrow of a nation. Peter Hackus, NBC News, Washington.
Among those, of course, who witnessed the disaster today, the students of Krista McAuliffe, a teacher at Concord High in New Hampshire. The youngsters were wearing party hats at the time, watching television when disaster struck. Their cheers turned to stony silence as they realized the Challenger had exploded. Many teachers and students alike were crying today. Finally, the students just picked up their books and went back to the classroom. Later, they were sent home early. When President Reagan announced his Teacher in Space program, one of the first to try for it was Frank Markham. He's a teacher, a history teacher at Booker T. Washington High School here in Tulsa, and he joins us live tonight. Mr. Markham, first of all, thank you for taking time to be with us this evening. I know that this has been a terribly emotional day for you. Could you bring us up to date on your involvement with the program? How close did you get?
Well, Sam, it was marvelously close, something that I had always wanted. I got to be with the group in Washington, D.C., and from that they chose 10 people, and then from that they chose the one. So it was state finalists and into the semis in Washington, D.C.
It was right down to the wire for you. I know that you knew the teacher that was on board today, and I'd like to have you address that in just a few moments. But first of all, we're going to roll the video. You made a remark earlier to me this evening that you had the feeling something was wrong with the shot. Can you tell me at what point you felt it went wrong?
Yes, I'll try to. The ship took off normally, as they say, nominal. It started its roll. Here you can see that. Then you have a normal. Okay, now it shows it here. This is not the original one that we saw on television because you could actually see the plume go up, and from the back, they've shown this one now so much now that they don't show the other one anymore.
They brought it down some. So it was somewhat before.
It was before this scene here, to where it was from the rear, and you can see a plume, and then you see a shot of smoke and plumage go out long before the solid rocket booster should have separated.
There's been some talk that this shot was a little slower than the others. Did you feel that way?
Well, I don't know if it was slower. The weather was quite different at the Cape, changing rapidly. They had some problems. Then, of course, the mechanical problems of the day before with the famous little screw. But I think that they're very safety conscious, and they have to just let it go as it can. Mother Nature takes the rest.
Before we wind up this evening, we discussed a spirit. Even though today had a tragic ending, the feeling is the spirit of this particular teacher must live on.
Yes. Krista was vivacious. She was dynamic as a teacher, and she felt so strongly about quality education for young people. And I feel that all the NASA ambassadors, myself and those who were involved in this program, should strive to make sure that Krista did not die in vain, that the project will go on, and that young people will still be excited about the space program.
Again, Frank Markham, thank you much for taking time to be with us this evening.
Thank you, Sam.
Here at home, a number of area youngsters were watching coverage of the launch on television sets in their schools. 13-year-old Ryan Harper, an 8th grader at Edison Middle School in Tulsa, said he didn't have to watch for any particular reason. He was just interested.
I couldn't believe it, really. It was like, that couldn't have happened. Need to see that again. Your stomach just dropped. It was like you heard something you really didn't want to, but you saw it. And you really thought of the people on there, if they'd felt anything, and, you know, their kids and their relatives watching. It was really pretty sad.
Lori Cole is a 15-year-old student at Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa. She was one of several gathered in front of a television set as the shuttle was launched.
I didn't really understand what was happening, but after Mr. Markham said that it had exploded, my reaction was, how can this really be happening? And I was like in shock. But after the replays, after they had shown it a while, my action, you know, this is real. And it did happen. And I did cry.
That reaction was mirrored by many of those who witnessed the terrible tragedy this morning outside the Kennedy Space Center. Beth is standing by now on the interview set with more on that. Beth?
Thank you, Sam. Another question in the minds of many. Is this an event that may have an adverse effect on those youngsters who watched? Joining us live tonight is Dr. Bruce Carpenter, a TU professor and child psychologist and a parent. Dr. Carpenter, thank you for joining us this evening. Is there any adverse effect, if any at all, on the children who did watch?
The space program is something we all identify with, and with a teacher on board, I think that's especially true for school children. I think that we can expect them to experience the same sense of shock, grief, and sorrow as a consequence of this event. For some of them, especially those that are more sensitive, it might be a very difficult experience.
What age bracket of youngsters could be more sensitive to this?
Probably our older children and teenagers. Younger children have little context in which to evaluate such an experience. And while they can sense the grief of those around them and thereby maybe learn what such feelings are about, the older ones really already know, and they could share in it much like all of us.
Do you think perhaps some of the youngsters have a delayed reaction to this?
I suspect that some will, in particular as they see how serious it is by the reactions of their parents and others, that they too will start to evaluate it perhaps differently and sense more grief in their own response because of that.
So for those children who may have really felt this ordeal, what can we as parents do to say to these children to help?
Well, in particular for the older children and those that might be more sensitive, they often have a reluctance to talk about such things. It's usually helpful if we can spend a little time asking them about their feelings, sharing some of our own, perhaps not making too big of a thing of the seriousness and the tragedy of it all, but nevertheless letting them know that we too feel sorrow and loss over the experience, and that it symbolizes for us the greatness of our country, and hence the fact that when we try great things, we sometimes run into serious problems.
All right, Dr. Bruce Carpenter, we want to thank you for coming down and sharing your thoughts with us this evening. President Reagan is also concerned about America's school children. He spoke to them this afternoon during a nationally televised address on the tragedy. Here are the words of comfort he offered them.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future.
The president added that the nation had never had a tragedy like this, and he declared this a day for mourning and remembering. Sam?
Well, among the many who will never forget today's accident are the Tulsa employees of North American Rockwell. They manufactured the cargo doors for the shuttle at the local plant, and a company spokesman here says that many of them were watching a live broadcast of the launch when today's disaster occurred.
Well, yes, I think everybody was stunned, in disbelief, and couldn't believe their eyes and ears. Certainly all the people at Rockwell take working on spacecraft and aircraft very seriously. They're very proud of what they do, and they're concerned.
Mr. Blankenship didn't want to speculate on what caused today's accident, but he did point out it was the first time in America's 56 manned space flights that there's been a loss of life.
Oklahoma Governor George Nye ordered flags across the state today to have staff in honor of the Challenger crew. Nye called this morning's explosion of the shuttle a terrible tragedy, and on behalf of all Oklahomans, he extended sympathy to the crew members' families.
Still to come, Muskogee police are asking for your help tonight. We'll have a report.
And a brutal shooting claims 2 lives at a Northside elementary school. This and more when we come back. A Tulsa elementary school guidance counselor and her ex-boyfriend are dead tonight, victims of a murder-suicide on Tulsa's north side. Newscast reporter Marty Griffin has been following the story. Marty, does anybody know what happened?
Well, apparently Vivian Clark, the guidance counselor, and her old boyfriend, Roy Evans, had problems in the past, Beth. And according to witnesses, Roy Evans went to the Andrew Jackson Elementary School this afternoon with the intention of ending those problems one way or another. About 15 minutes before school ended at Andrew Jackson Elementary today, police say Roy Evans pulled up in this pickup truck and went inside the building. Moments later, he came back out to the parking lot with counselor Vivian Clark, pulled a double-barreled shotgun from his truck, killed her, then killed himself. Before police arrived, both Evans and Clark were dead. Co-workers who heard the gunshots had no idea Vivian Clark was having personal problems. But she did tell the school principal a man had been causing her trouble and maybe violent. Despite the warning, school officials don't think the shootings could have been prevented.
It's a tragic occurrence. I'm afraid, however, when you consider that we do employ nearly 5,000 people within the school system and we are part of the community in many ways, that some acts like this do spill over into the schools.
As the bodies of 46-year-old Vivian Clark and 50-year-old Roy Evans were taken from the scene today, everyone knew what happened. No one knew why. Vivian Clark had been a counselor at the Andrew Jackson Elementary School for almost 4 years. Everyone that knew her and worked with her considered her to be an excellent worker and a good friend.
Marty, what do we know about Roy Evans?
Very little, except that he had dated her quite some time ago and that they had had problems and that she had warned the school officials about potential problems. We talked to the family a little bit tonight, and they are very upset. He has quite a few relatives here in Tulsa.
I'm sure. You've got something else for us, don't you?
Yes, we do. In Muskogee, a house burglary is the subject for this week's Crime Stoppers. The break-in occurred at 404 Queens in the Grandview Housing Edition. It took place last Friday, January 24th, sometime between 8:30 a.m. and 10 p.m. The suspects entered the back of the house using a crowbar to pry the door open. Once inside, they locked the dog in the bathroom. Finding a suitcase, they filled it with pewter and silver items, jewelry boxes, and a telephone. The larger items that were stolen include a television set and several firearms, a .30-30 Winchester, a Mossberg .22 caliber automatic, and a Mossberg 20-gauge shotgun. The stolen items amounted to over $9,000. Police think the suspects may have been a male and a female. Now, if you have any information about this crime or any crime, call Crime Stoppers in Muskogee at 683-1000. If your information leads to an arrest, you could receive up to a $1,000 reward.
All right, Marty, thank you very much. Well, on a lighter note, the weather. It was another beautiful day.
I'm about ready for some change, and hopefully Mr. Shore is standing by with a little bit of change to accommodate us. He's when we come back. Hopefully we got some change coming because we all need a little rain in this part of the country.
It looks like the major pattern is going to change, but let's take a look at that jet stream pattern one more time, Sam, because it's the same pattern that brought the record-breaking cold air into Florida this morning. Now, here's the way the jet stream looked earlier this morning, just a couple of hours before the disaster down there at Cape Canaveral, and you can see a very strong jet stream, and it was extending and running down from the extreme northern states and then diving right across the Cape, across central Florida. And that jet stream with winds of 125 miles an hour at upper levels probably was not itself a factor, but there is still the possibility that the cold air that it brought down there with it, with temperatures in the 20s before the launch this morning and just above freezing by a few degrees actually at the time of the launch, that could possibly have been a factor, but it's really speculation at this point. A chance of some showers by Saturday night, and then a change towards a wetter and cooler pattern next week. Remember, this is still winter, and we still could see some snow around here.
You're funning me. We can use
wetter
a little
weather
change.
coming, right?
Thanks,
okay. Coming up in sports, the BOK Tennis Classic draws a good field again.
Plus, we'll have a look at a rare two-sport college athlete. Jerry will have these stories and more when we come back. This just in, Tulsa police and IMSA units are on the scene right now of a disturbance at McLean High School. IMSA officials tell us they have reports of more than one police officer being injured. We have no other details as to how the disturbance started or how the officers were injured or exactly what that disturbance is all about. But repeating, Tulsa police units and IMSA units are on the scene of an apparent disturbance at McLean High School in North Tulsa. We'll have more on the story as it becomes available and a full report tomorrow on Oklahoma Today.
Well, on a day like today, we still have a lot going on in sports, don't we, Jerry?
Quite a bit happening, Beth, and we'll report it right now. Coach Raymond Berry says his New England Patriots have been dealing with a drug problem since last January. The team voted yesterday to undergo a voluntary testing program. The Players Union is enraged. They'll file an unfair labor practice charge against the Patriots, contending the testing plan violates the collective bargaining agreement. As for fishing tomorrow, the forecaster says 3:30 this morning, and then again a beautiful period around about 4:30 tomorrow afternoon.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Jerry. School board election time in Tulsa today.
And we'll show you how area youngsters played a unique role in one polling place. That's next.
Tulsa voters who cast their ballots today at Perry Elementary were presented a special treat when they reached the polls. Voters were shown a video the students produced to show all of the good things happening at Perry. Now, the purpose of the project was to show folks in Tulsa without school-age children the importance of the school to the entire community. That was a nice project, and we'll have more on the election itself tomorrow. For now, that's our edition of the Nightcast for this Tuesday evening. Thank you for being with us.
For your morning's news, be sure to join Bill Shield for Oklahoma Today. We'll see you back here at 5. Until, thank you for joining us, and good night.